And we welcome you to this conversation in partnership with the Bipartisan Policy Center and Purdue University's Center for Tech Diplomacy. I'm Steve Scully. The book is titled Risk, A User's Guide by General Stanley McChrystal. And that conversation coming up in just a moment, led by former Undersecretary of State Keith Krach. But to begin this conversation and to set up the book and the premise behind the book, I want to welcome Jason Grumet. He is the president and co-founder of the Bipartisan Policy Center, and Bonnie Glick, who is with the Center for Tech Diplomacy. The timing of this coming as we mark the 80th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor and now facing some 21st century risks. To set up the conversation and the last night though, Jason Grumet.
Thank you, Steve Scully. So I think, Bonnie and I want to talk just a little bit about, the context that has brought our organizations together and last night's discussion. And so I'm going to lead off with a little bit about the spirit of the discussion. And then I think Bonnie may frame out some of the parts of the discussion last night that were really quite fascinating. So I think most people are aware of the fact that Senator Bob Dole passed away earlier this week. And Senator Dole, along with Senators Daschle, Howard Baker, George Mitchell, were the founders of the Bipartisan Policy Center. So I've been thinking a lot about Senator Dole. And of all the pieces of advice Senator Dole gave us when we were starting this organization, the most compelling to me was he basically said, look, I don't want to be part of a apolitical situation. I'm a politician. I'm not nonpartisan. I'm not bipartisan, transpartisan. He said, I want to be at a place where you don't leave anything at the door, but you take everything to the table, where you have a fulsome, constructive conversation, where there's ample opportunities for disagreement, for appreciating our own fallibility, and at the same time, fundamentally caring about the nation above all else. And that was the spirit of last night's conversation. I think that, General McChrystal has always kind of channeled that version of public service. Keith Krach was just really, I think, terrific in expressing his views of putting the nation ahead of all else. And so it was really a wonderful opportunity for us to begin this partnership with Bonnie and the Purdue Center. And so with that, I will turn it to you, Bonnie, to talk a little bit about the substance of the discussion.
Jason, thanks so much. The conversation that you all are about to listen to was really illuminating, and it goes directly to the heart of some of the things that we think about in the Center for Tech Diplomacy. We don't, as a government, have a history of talking about things like technology and innovation as critical elements of American foreign policy, and that is a risk. And this is what was discussed about General McChrystal's book. I think this risk is in part because our diplomats tend not to be drawn from engineering programs or engineering disciplines, but rather from liberal arts and social sciences. And there's the rub. This is where the risk comes in. We understand that there's a huge gap, and it's constantly growing, between technology and innovation and the ability of non-engineers to understand that technology. We're looking for ways to bridge those gaps, to mitigate the understanding of the risks, and to bring the culture of technology more into line with the culture of our foreign policy world. One of the interesting things that Keith Krach and General Stan McChrystal will touch on is the risks that are built into communications and cultures. When you think about it, the culture of diplomats, meaning a crew of people who are largely drawn from social sciences, and the culture of engineers who are highly technical, don't often overlap. Our foreign policy efforts suffer when our diplomats cannot go toe-to-toe with their foreign counterparts in discussions about semiconductors or artificial intelligence or synthetic biology or hypersonics. We're looking at ways to bridge those gaps and to mitigate those risks. And we're excited to have General McChrystal join Keith Krach on the board of the Center for Tech Diplomacy. Jason, I'd love to throw out to you a question that, in the spirit of Senator Dole, looks toward the way he reflected on bipartisanship. What are your thoughts, channeling the senator, for how we move forward in areas like diplomacy with a focus on innovation, on technology, and on the creative American spirit?
Well, look, I think, a lot of people will ask us, can Congress still govern a divided country, or is the institution just, fundamentally broken? And the honest answer is yes. Congress still has the capacity, if the issues are designed appropriately, to, actually do good work and advance. And, even in the last week, despite all of the headwinds, they adopted a budget, they passed the National Defense Authorization Act, they have, worked out the self-inflicted recurring crisis of the debt ceiling. So they still have the capacity to get some things done. Generally members of Congress are good people with bad incentives. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about how can you actually improve those incentives. And one is, as you're suggesting, focusing on issues where there is a long history of collaboration. Technology innovation is certainly long been a place where Democrats and Republicans have fundamentally shared a sense that that is the unique competitive essence of our country. It's what drives our innovation and our entrepreneurship. And so we have actually seen quite a bit of collaborative legislation advancing clean energy technologies, semiconductor technology. And the question that you're raising now is a place where we're starting to think a lot about, which is what is the question of that international technology transfer and technology competition as we think about things like artificial intelligence and 5G communications and the metaverse. So, we're really eager to work with you to understand more about that kind of, foreign policy aspect of the technology debate.
And just a quick follow-up on Keith Krach, who of course is the former Undersecretary of State in the Trump administration, a businessman from Ohio, former CEO of DocuSign, and former chair of the Board of Trustees of Purdue University. And Jason, I know you have a question for Bonnie.
I think as we kind of roll into the event, so yeah, Ben, I do have a question for you. So, I understand the word technology and I understand the word diplomacy in a very intentional way. You have, brought those ideas together, and you talked a little bit about the foundation for that, but almost ask you the same question. I mean, what are the key issues on the horizon that you see that really animate the center's work?
Jason, thank you. I love that question because people who are hearing about the Center for Tech Diplomacy for the first time, which is a lot of people because we're brand new, started just over 2 months ago. When people think about technology and diplomacy, they usually don't put those two words together. And that's the crux of the issue for us. Here we are on the 80th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor, which was a military attack. When we think now about the next engagement of the United States, it's pretty certain that the next time that we're substantively and substantially attacked as a country, it'll probably be a technological attack. And when you think about that in the context of diplomacy, you understand why it's important for our diplomats and for our allies to focus on how we incorporate technology, whether it's on the cyber front or in the more emerging technologies in the next pandemic, the next hypersonic launch. It's important to incorporate that technology into all of our conversations. Diplomats need to know more than foreign languages. It's really important, of course, that they can speak foreign languages, understand the cultures of the countries in which they serve. But today it's not enough. They have to use technology to advance freedom and human rights around the world, no matter the language that they're talking in.
Which is so much of the work that you're doing at Purdue University. Jason Grumet, the president of the Bipartisan Policy Center, thank you. And Bonnie Glick, the work that you're doing at the Center for Tech Diplomacy. The book is titled Risk, a User's Guide. Former West Point graduate and Army General Stanley McChrystal in a conversation that took place here in Washington, D.C., led by former Undersecretary of State Keith Krach.
Well, Stan, thanks so much for joining me, and congratulations on your new book,
Great.
Risk, a User's Guide. And, I really enjoyed reading that. So I'm such a big fan of transformational leadership. And it's really a playbook for transformational leaders of all types, whether they're CEOs or diplomats or in the military or just have a noble cause. So, really my first question to you, and you've written some great books. Why'd you write this one?
Yeah, it's great. And first, thanks for the kind words, Keith. Someone who has lived with risk and done it in business and done it in the State Department, that's bona fides I really appreciate. It is interesting. I spent a life like most of us trying to learn about risk.
Yeah.
Starting at West Point, they try to teach you about risk. You study military issues and things. And then as you're a leader through life and in combat, you deal with risk.
Yeah.
And I came to the conclusion, I didn't do it very well. And I really didn't know why.
Mm-hmm.
There are all these formal processes for measuring risk and mitigating it. And then the outcome was often not what I wanted.
Yeah.
And I extrapolate that farther and I watch for other organizations or nations. The same thing is true. We have this science of dealing with risk, and then almost every time we're swinging at a curveball when it's a fastball.
Right.
And so I thought I'd take a look at it and see if I could write something that might be helpful to people.
Well, the thing I really enjoyed about the book is you took a few stabs at kind of doing the classic mathematical analysis, and the one where you're like, he's like 0.999, and it's an art, right? And this month is Pearl Harbor, 8th anniversary of Pearl Harbor, and you and I have talked about this offline. That if there's going to be a next one, it's probably going to be a digital Pearl Harbor. How do we prepare, or how do we mitigate for that kind of risk?
Yeah, I think the first thing is to understand what that risk is.
Yeah.
Because we are the most connected society in history,
Right.
and therefore, in many ways, the most vulnerable society in history. I would argue that if you turned the electricity off in a major U.S. city for a number of hours, it would go to almost post-apocalyptic activities pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And if you had been able to take out our information, just our internet connection, think all the things that wouldn't work, our banking, our daily lives, we lived. And so we are dependent upon things that we sometimes forget that we are dependent upon.
Right.
So we start with that basic reality that it's pretty important to us. And then we say, well, how will it get attacked? And the answer is, we don't know. It could be attacked digitally from someone in the basement of a third world country. It could be attacked by a nation state. It could be physically attacked.
Right.
People could actually go to take out key nodes. And so because it's impossible to accurately predict exactly the time or nature of the attack, what we've really got to do is understand what will we do when we are attacked.
Right.
How are we going to be able to be resilient enough so that we can take a hit, pick ourselves up, and keep going? So it's avoiding that fragility that we often talk about.
Yeah, that's so key. When I was running economic diplomacy at the State Department, one of our urgent missions was to really defeat the Chinese Communist Party's master plan to control 5G, because it looked like it was inevitable. And one of the things that I think it was out of the box thinking at the State Department, at least that's what they told me, was I brought in 12 folks from the private sector, entrepreneurs and technologists and results-oriented execs. You've met many of them. You were on the DocuSign advisory board, and teamed them up with the career foreign service folks. I call it a 60-60 deal. Both parties get the best part of the deal. And it was amazing to see the folks coming in from Silicon Valley. They had so much respect for the foreign service officers and the civil service, because they could see that their true North Star was national security. They also could see they were super smart. They could speak 4 to 7 languages. They rotated countries and all that. And you've heard me say it many times. If you see one of these foreign service officers or civil servants, just like you would somebody like you in the military, you thank them for their service, because they're really unsung heroes. And it was a really magical thing and turned out to be a high performance team. So my question to you is, in terms of building a high performance team, how do you use risk to help build that performance team? And then, what are some of the advantages of a high performance team then dealing with risk?
Right. If you consider risk, we tend to think of it as the intersection of the probability of something happening and the consequences if it does.
Right.
If I go up on the roof, what's the probability I'll fall off? And if I do, will I get hurt?
Mm-hmm.
But think of it differently. Think of it now mathematically as the product of threats
Yep.
we face times our vulnerability to those
Yep.
threats. And the result is risk.
Yep.
If you could do away with all the threats in the world,
Yep.
you don't got nothing to worry about.
Right.
But you can't. We don't live in that world.
Right.
And we don't control those threats. But we do control how vulnerable we are.
Uh-huh.
And so we have agency over what we know, how we communicate, how we interact.
Yep.
And so when you talk about marriage of the State Department and private sector,
Yep.
what I would argue you were first doing was you were eliminating blind spots. You were bringing in diversity.
Right.
Sometimes we talk about diversity and we say, well, that's different genders or different sexual orientations or races. It's different perspectives.
Right.
It's ensuring that your
Right.
blind spots
Right.
are covered.
And that's one of the things I learned in Silicon Valley is diversity of thought is the catalyst for genius. Right.
That's exactly
Yeah.
right. If you don't have that, you are automatically vulnerable because you have places that
Right.
the threats can come in. So I think that starts. And then the next one is communication.
Right.
Think about the times in history. We write in the book about failures of communication, one of
Right.
which was the failure of the Light Brigade.
Yeah.
You know, the famous charge of the Light Brigade
Yeah.
occurs because a message is sent from one commander to another and it's
Yeah.
misunderstood.
Right.
And so these 600 Light Brigade cavalrymen ride most to their death.
Right.
And it was just a failure to effectively communicate. And we say, well, communication's easy. We got cell phones, we got internet, we can do meetings.
Yeah.
But in reality, communication is hard.
Yep.
Not only do you have to have the physical ability to
Yeah.
communicate, you have to have the willingness to communicate.
Right.
And if you take people in business traditionally, or
Yep.
people in the State Department, or people in the Defense Department, those aren't just different groups, those are different cultures.
Right.
They are different languages.
Right.
In Afghanistan, I would sit down with Pashtun elders, and they would have big turbans and beards and faces, you know, that reflected a tough life.
Yeah.
They had a different language than I did, a different religion. They had a different life
Yeah.
experience, but it was evident to me.
Yep.
And so we understood that we had
Yep.
this gulf. When I was in Defense Department and we dealt with the State Department, we're all speaking English. We're all
Yeah.
Americans. Theoretically, we ought to be able to perfectly communicate, but it was such different cultures
Yeah.
that you could talk right past each other and
Right.
not know it.
Right.
And that's true in almost every
Yep.
business and whatnot. So
Yep.
I think understanding how important communication is and then how hard it is.
Yeah.
So you've got to not only be able to focus on it, but you've got to be able to measure whether you're really communicating.
Right. You know, when I was reading about that section in the book, it made me think back early in my career when I was at General Motors. So my first job, I was a production foreman on a chassis line, a Cadillac, second shift. And about 50% of cars coming off the line were going to the repair bin. And by the way, this is when Cadillac, this was in the late 70s. Cadillac was known as the standard of the world. And I went and I complained to the superintendent. I said, man, this is supposed to be great quality. And he goes, I'm going to teach you something. You know, because he kind of was a mentor for me. And he goes, I'm going to take you to these different meetings. And what I would watch is as it would go up to the next level and say, oh, we have these 3 quality issues. And it would go up to the plant superintendent. It would go, oh, we have this 1 quality issue. Then it would go to the VP of Cadillac and say, you know, we're working on some quality issues. And then that next summer, I went to the New York Treasurer's office, which was the staff for the board of directors. And I could see it going up then to the VP, and it said, our quality is good. Then it goes to the executive VP, and it goes, we're the standard of the world. And then I saw it go up to the board, and it's, we have no competition. And I learned that. And the other thing also that I learned is, you know, this is back when General Motors had 1.5 million people. There was not a lot of diversity of thought. It was inbred. And so I really believe that was one of the causes to lose such a great leadership position. But anyway, I can totally relate to that. So let me ask you this. You know, trust is big. It means so much to me. And we actually use that to defeat China's master plan to control 5G. We ended up building the Clean Network Alliance of Democracies, 60 countries and 200 telcos. And we made that our strategic positioning because every time I talk to my foreign counterparts, they say, you know, China is really important to us, but we don't trust them. Tell me, what role does trust play in risk mitigation and many of the things you talked about in the book?
Yeah. You know, we use the word trust, and sometimes it gets cheapened.
Yeah.
It is so sacred. If you think what a lack of trust does, is it increases transaction costs.
Right.
If I'm going to deal with you and I don't trust you or know you, I'm going to check what you say. I'm going to have my lawyer along. We're going to do all of these things.
Right.
And so we add cost to it.
Yep.
And so when we trust each other, we can cut all of that out.
Yep.
But trust doesn't come simply because someone says trust somebody. It comes from interaction over time.
Right.
What I found in the military force is you had to force elements to work together.
Yep.
So they build up some shared experience.
Right.
And trust, I think, to a great degree, comes from establishing credibility from your proven competence,
Right.
your integrity, and the relationships you build.
Yes.
I used to always tell the counterterrorist force, those three things were sacred.
Yep.
We protect those.
Yep.
We will have the trust of people we need their support of.
Right.
And so when you talk about reducing risks, being able to trust certain things means you can focus on the things that you cannot trust.
Right.
So if, in a military sense, if you don't have to worry about your flanks and your rear, you can focus forward.
Absolutely.
If you don't trust the people on your left and right or the people to your rear, you got to look everywhere.
Right.
And that's true in business. It's true in the world. So what you did with the Clean Network is you expanded the trust, the number of partners.
Right.
You basically covered America's flanks and our rear so we could then focus on a limited number of external threats.
Right.
And I think that is something we've got to, in every walk of our nation and in business, we got to focus on.
Right. Absolutely. You know, I always say it's the most important word in any language. You know, you do business with people you trust, you partner with people you trust, you certainly love people you trust. You know, it was interesting because when I heard that from my foreign counterparts, it reminded me back at DocuSign where I would stand up, you know, in front of employees or an advisory board and say, we're not in this software business, we're in the trust business. And certainly 5G was that. And certainly a lot of the things that we're dealing with in terms of the techno-authoritarianism from China. You know, one of the things, you know, we've got a lot going on these days, right? In the foreign policy world. And, you know, when you have an adversary, you know, really bad actors on the planet, and they don't live by a set of those trust principles, things like integrity or transparency or respect for rule of law or property or human rights or the planet, you know, how do you deal with that? What are some of the things you could do?
Yeah, I think the first thing is, again, you look inward. If you think of the range of crises that arise in our lives, whether it's a financial crisis or a natural disaster or a pandemic, about 80% of what you do in response to that is the same crisis to crisis. And we say, no, it isn't. Yes, it is. You start by communicating effectively, get correct information out on a timely basis to the people who need it, up and down. You have a clear narrative. Here's what we're trying to do. Here's how we're aligning on that. You have to overcome inertia, so you have to be able to act. And sometimes overcoming inertia means you've got to stop things that are going in a certain direction. You've got to be able to bring in diversity so you don't have blind spots, but also be aware of and overcome your biases. You've got to be able to do things in a timely fashion, i.e., as we know, something done too early or too late is often counterproductive. There's got to be leadership that pulls all this together. So my response is, if you focus on making your organization, and a nation's just a big organization, we make ourselves stronger. Then almost any threat that comes is reduced to those things unique about that situation. Because we can handle most anything. So if it's a pandemic, okay, we will focus on pandemic unique items and vice versa. And I would argue an external threat like the Chinese or the Russians fall into that same category. When we are fragile internally, when we're politically divided, when we don't have trust, when we don't communicate effectively, then suddenly we are vulnerable to things that we wouldn't otherwise be vulnerable to normally.
Exactly. One of the things I loved about your book, as you're talking right now, I'm picturing that framework that you drew. And I can picture you like going to a whiteboard, like going to this, say, hey, here's the framework, how you analyze, risk and mitigate it. And you hit it in all those key elements. And I always find that those frameworks for me, just like you said, hey, you're kind of dealing with the same thing. It's just the situation's different. And if you have a framework like that, then you can develop pattern recognition, which kind of turns to instinct, which actually helps you move fast because a lot of times you don't have a lot of time to react. I mean, I could certainly see it in Silicon Valley, but you running the special forces, I'm like nothing compared to what you've experienced.
I wish we'd had you then, but you remember the day you came to my company?
Yeah.
And you sat down and you said, here's what you got to do. Boom, boom, boom. And we had been at it for 10 years. And we looked at this and we're going, why didn't we come up with that in a decade? Because you put a framework out and said, this is where you got to fit and the things you got to do.
Right. And by the way, that's the same framework I've just been using company to company and then using it in the State Department.
We're using
the acclaimed network,
and it's working great. That's a key thing. The way that framework came out was this Yale immunologist and I became friends. And what she did was she came over and said, I think counterinsurgency is like the human immune system.
By the way, it's in.
And I remember looking and I said, I know nothing about the human immune system. What do you know about counterinsurgency? And she says, I don't, but I just have this gut feeling. And so
it was a timely analogy.
Oh, it was perfect.
Yeah,
and so
it really was.
But we came out with the realization that things like HIV/AIDS don't kill anybody. And you say, well, wait a minute, it's deadly. No, it weakens your immune system so that you're vulnerable.
Right.
And so organizations that are flawed internally, that don't communicate, are misaligned on their narrative, have poor leadership, or can't overcome inertia, they become vulnerable to anything. They don't need a strong competitor to come and take market share. They are going to fall to a weak competitor or any number. And so that model is all a way of saying we've got to make our risk immune system. We've got to make our organizations healthier. And then we can be durable.
Yeah. I mean, you're absolutely right. It's basically focused on the home front, right? And that trust is the lubricant in that engine for risk mitigation.
That's right.
Right. It was really interesting to see, the reaction from some of the State Department people when I said, hey, strategic positioning and trust. They're like, well, what's strategic position? I said, well, the reason why you do it is to deposition your competitors. And the reason to do that is to set traps, right? I mean, it's all military analogies you and I talked about before. And the value of that strategic position is the delta between your position and the other, your opponent's position. And it's got to be true. It can't be a fake brand. You either have the high ground or you don't. And you also don't have to be faster than the bear. You just have to be faster than the slowest person, right? You don't have to be perfect. And when we looked at those trust principles with China that they'd been using against us, if I could steal your intellectual property, if I can use slave labor, coal-fired power plants, not have to be transparent, I'm going to beat you every time. And so what we just did is we just flipped them on their back and we used those trust principles against them to build unity and ended up being continuity of policy because that unity was key for a security blanket against a retaliation.
Yeah, a nation like China, which is rising economically and militarily and is pretty unified politically, at least externally, is a frightening prospect and a threat. But they've got some real vulnerabilities. And almost the principles of judo work because as they throw their weight around the world, they frighten people. And they come after resources, they do things. And so they create an antibody-like response to them.
Right.
So what you were doing is just simply unifying the antibodies.
Yeah, and taking that thing, right?
That's right.
Taking that their negative momentum.
That's right.
Yeah.
The things that they do that scare people.
Yeah, because they scare a lot. So let me ask you this: we always talk about mentorship, it's the Global Mentor Network means a lot to me. You're in our pilot series. It's about mentoring that next generation of transformational leaders. The question everybody wants to know is, what advice would you give, not to those aspiring transformational, but what advice would you give to a young Stan McChrystal with regard to risk?
Yeah.
Looking back, you're 21 years old or however.
I think of the tough things in my life where things have gone very badly.
Yeah.
And when they came out right, they came out right for several reasons. One, because I had a clear sense of who I was.
Yeah.
And even when I would be buffeted by something, that. The second was close relationships. I had a network of friends,
Right.
starting, of course, with my wife, Annie, who you know
Right.
well, but with other friends those relationships were even stronger than I realized.
Right.
And in the moment when I needed them,
Right.
they were there.
Like your accountability brothers. Yep.
Exactly.
Yep.
And then more broadly, not close friends, but people that I had a level of trust with and interaction with.
Right.
And they became allies at the critical moment
Right.
and that sort of thing. So although many of the things that you face in life are fairly unexpected and they can be pretty powerful,
Yeah.
if you've got that kind of a network around you, as
Right.
you know from the Mentor Network, and you've got
Yeah.
a certain sense of you are that for them,
Yep.
if they are that for you, then suddenly you're extraordinarily more safe. It's the principle of NATO or any other.
Right.
The idea of Article 5, if somebody attacks one of us,
Yes.
they've attacked all of us.
Absolutely.
And if you've got friendships who, when you are needy,
Right.
maybe they're not going to attack anybody, but they're going to come for you. They're going to come take care of you.
You know it.
And when you've got that, almost nothing is anything you can't withstand.
Right.
I think people are most vulnerable when you feel alone.
Absolutely.
We look at veterans who commit suicide or whatnot.
Absolutely.
They often feel as though they've got nowhere to turn, no one
Right.
to turn to, no shoulder to
Right.
grab onto. And so I think that thinking about that decreases risk
Yeah.
because you're just more stable.
Yeah. It's interesting because I think about a thing we talked about many times about dealing with that China bully is that if there, we've all been bullied probably at some time in our life. If there's anything I learned, when you confront a bully, they back down, but they really, really back down when you have your friends by your side.
Right.
And I mean, to have that feeling there. And, so speaking of COVID in the pandemic, that has forever changed the world. And one of those big areas is in the area of supply chains. We experience it in pharmaceuticals, we're experiencing it now in semiconductors. We were fortunate to onshore TSMC, $12 billion, largest onshoring in history, and it grew to about $250 billion of U.S. investment and jobs. And so what I'd be interested in is your perspective from a national security side. How important are those supply chains? How important is that for our national security, our economic security? And then what advice would you give to CEOs who have a lot of those tied up in various places?
Yeah, I think they're critical because first, for finished goods that are manufactured somewhere, often all of the supporting manufacturing there. So it's harder than just moving a single factory. You've got to get all the suppliers available too.
Right.
Because if you are dependent upon a foreign location for any part of it, you've
Right.
got some level of dependency.
Right.
So we say we're going to move things. It's hard, but in some cases, I think we have to build the capability to do that. But there are other things we can't move. We can't move rare earths and things like that where they are mined somewhere else. We've got to create the ability to have secure chains.
Right.
Much of my career, my early military career, was focused on ensuring that oil would flow from the Persian Gulf around the world and to the United States.
Right.
That's less true now, but the reality was there's always going to be something
Right.
that globally we need.
Right.
Now, my argument is that pure capitalism is going to seek the lowest cost,
Mm-hmm.
and it won't always be balanced with geopolitics.
Right.
And so a corporate leader will go to make the most inexpensive way to get goods,
Yeah.
but that will put us in vulnerable locations
Right.
in many cases. And so I think we've got to get a melding. I think the United States has got to get a bit of what I'd call industrial policy
Yep.
that says certain things have got to be here, other things have got to be with secure supply lines,
Absolutely.
with allies. And at the end of the day, I don't think globalization's dead. It shouldn't be dead.
Yeah.
It's just too important. But I think that means you've got to have that network of trust
Absolutely.
with your allies and
Absolutely.
trusted business partners around the world.
Absolutely. And thing we've learned about globalization, it assumes everybody plays by the rules.
Right.
And we all believe in the free market, but when you have somebody not play by the rules, the market is no longer free. It becomes a fool's market. Well, I'm telling you, I could talk forever with you, Stan. And I just want to congratulate you again on that book. I love the book. I'm recommending it to all my friends. I know you've got a really, really busy schedule. And really, thanks for imparting your wisdom in that book. And when like the first time I met you, I just wanted to hear the war stories. I'm just like, oh, tell me some stories. And there's plenty in there. So it's good from a playbook standpoint, but it's a page turner all in one. So thanks so much, Stan. We appreciate the time. Appreciate you being on C-SPAN, and have a happy holidays and a Merry Christmas.
Absolutely. Thanks for your friendship, Keith. I appreciate it.
Always. Thank you, Stan.
Take care.
Thanks.
A conversation into the Washington, D.C. home of Keith Krach on what was the 80th anniversary of the attack by the Japanese on Pearl Harbor as we look at 21st century threats. And Tom Romanoff, who's joining us from his home in Tacoma Park, Maryland, as you assess the conversation and the premise of the book behind General Stanley McChrystal on risk. What's your overall takeaway?
So I'd say my overall takeaway from this conversation is that trust is huge. In a diplomatic sense, trust is a way forward for alliance building, and they touch upon that with addressing the 5G issue. And in a tech sense, it seems as though this conversation talked about how trust is this sense of moving toward an interconnected systems, and that carries with it risks, which is how this book comes into play. Major theme that they talked about was globalization is not dead, but we need to address supply chains that are critical to our technology and competitive edge that technology has for the United States.
I would drill down just a little bit further, because in the conversation with Secretary Krach and General McChrystal, a lot of focus on China. From your perspective, just how real is the threat? What do Americans need to know about this?
Well, yeah, there is definitely a threat from China. I want to avoid painting with the wide brush on that front. But as a nation state, it is, actively working towards creating systems of espionage or gaining a competitive edge. And technology is one of those tools that they've been using. And it's a very real threat in terms of, our intellectual property in the United States, and that gives us a technology competitive edge, but also pharmaceuticals, telecommunications. So as a nation state, yes, it is a real threat. And the one thing that I've taken away is that, from a military perspective that General McChrystal brings to this is that risk has been identified, and there's now active measures trying to mediate that risk.
Risks identified, but we can't always know what those risks will be. But as the book points out, we can prepare for those risks. So what more do you think when it comes to technology do we need to do as a country and in the private sector? Because I know this very much is your world.
Yeah, so I think there was a quote in there where they talked about diversity of thought is needed to identify risks, and that is kind of the seed of genius. And you see that in the tech area, where especially private sector tech has incorporated this principle in a number of its management operations and who they bring to the table when it comes to developing out products for a diverse customer base. So, in that kind of approach from the private sector, they brought in a diversity of thought. And they talk a little bit about how in the federal government, there is this need to bring in engineers and diversity of thought to identify the risks, because a homogeneous population tends to speak the same language and not necessarily identify risks that are coming from a different language or different perspective. And there is a lot of good work happening in the federal government. I don't want to necessarily downplay the great work that U.S. Digital Services is doing, and the Presidential Innovation Fellows. They've addressed some of these things by bringing in what you can call young blood, but also some of these expertise and diversity of thought needed to identify risks in IT systems.
And one final point, because as you go through this book, there are a lot of stories. In one of the analogies in the conversation, imagine if the lights went off, how you would react to that. Mm-hmm. So we are so dependent on technology. What happens if something happens to that technology? If the lights literally go down, if the 5G network goes down?
Yeah. Well, speaking from personal experience, I was one of the first volunteer groups to go into New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, when most of the city was still dealing with blackouts. So I know firsthand what that post-apocalyptic view of without electricity looks like. And also, if you're going to, use technology and integrate it into our daily lives, which I think COVID has done for most Americans, then it is like the electricity went out. And so, there are a number of areas where we rely on it, from deliveries of our prescription drugs, food, communications with friends and neighbors, also work, and education. The digital divide there is something that I think most people recognize. So that gets to the supply chain need. You need to build in cybersecurity to these systems so that, we can continue to have this kind of, I guess you call it tech grid of sorts, or access to what we've integrated into our daily lives. And that's something that a lot of experts will say can't be bolted on. So cybersecurity needs to be built into these systems. And we have a great opportunity with the number of different bills that are in the House. You have the U.S. Innovation and Competitive Act, DHS supply chain risk, to last week where Federal Secure Cloud Improvement and Jobs Act all try to address these kind of upstream needs for mediating risk of, what if somebody can get into the supply chain and plant a malicious program in our electric grid, and how do we address that, and how do we build cybersecurity into these systems?
Tom Romanoff, thanks for adding your expertise to this conversation from the Bipartisan Policy Center, and this in cooperation with Purdue University and the Center for Tech Diplomacy. The book, it's titled Risk, a User's Guide by General Stanley McChrystal from Penguin Press. More information at bipartisanpolicy.org. Thank you.